Giving advice on YouTube is very difficult because I need a lot of info from you to actually help. So if you want real advice, fill out the eHarmony profile in the link below so I can help you properly. Welcome to The Good Ride, where we help average thrive and have been doing so full-time since 2010 and part-time since 2006. This is the Ultralight, and I'm James Beastie. Next to it is the Alpha Plus. I have the Alpha over there too, but that's enough for this review. And there's the Beta. I'll occasionally reference these two, but this Ultralight sits in its own world. I wish I had a Megalight to compare it to, but I didn't. But I was just stoked to get on all these Nidecker boards. And I rode this primarily with my Union Atlas and Burton Kendos, but I got the Atlas Pro on these as well, and tried some other boots and bindings too, but that was kind of my main thing here. And I got this in a wide variety of conditions, everything from midsummer Mount Hood to really good conditions at Mount Bachelor, to some good powder, to some even better powder, and some even better powder. So really wanted to spend some time on this Ultralight because I don't know when I'll get back on this again. It's not always that easy to get on this thing. To give you a short summary, this is a board I used to absolutely adore. Well, the Megalight, but the Megalight and the Ultralight are very close, and I used to own a Megalight. It was a different shape and a little different style back then, but they kind of tweaked it, made this a little more modern. It feels a little less directional, a little less tapered than it did back in the day, but it still has that great feel. And while I had a little better turning experience on other Nidecker boards, like the Beta, the Smoke, the Mellow, and even a little bit more so with the Alpha Plus and Alpha, I still felt it was a fun turning experience. And it's a very versatile ride with an incredibly fast base. It's got a great setback on board for powder, even though it's a pretty wide stance width, it still works. And it's just one of those boards that's really good for steep, technical, big mountain riding. And if that's what you're into, this might work for you. On top of all that, it's really good for being an ultralight board. It doesn't feel very bucky, bouncy, and chattery. It's very stiff, very damp, and very aggressive. And I like that without being hard to skid a turn when you get off your game. So it's aggressive and yet still forgiving, which is a cool combination. So when it comes to sizing, this 161 is just right. I tried a 158 a while back in the Megalight. That was a little too small for me. You ride this a little bigger, a little longer than you normally would because it's a narrower width than the modern, more wider boards out there these days, like the Mellow and the Smoke. But it worked really well for my boot size and for my weight in this 161, and I just thought it was great. Normally, ultralight boards don't do that well from my 180 to 190 pounds, and it did just fine. Now, when it comes to the shape, this is tapered and directional. The old Ultralight and Megalight felt a little more turny and a little more tapered, and I felt like I needed a little more back foot weight with those than this one. This one feels a little more centered. It needs a little less back foot weight than the old ones did, but it's still a board you need to lean back more on to keep that tail from washing because there is a decent amount of taper. And when it comes to the camber profile, there is a decent amount of camber underfoot. It's kind of like this directional free ride camber. There's a good bit of camber going a little bit past the back binding. It seems like it goes up to about the front of the binding, then goes to a little bit of flat and a little bit of rocker. But overall, it's kind of a mellow directional camber. It doesn't feel that hard to skid a turn. It doesn't feel that locked in, but it feels stable. It doesn't auto spin. It one foots off a chair really easy. You can traverse a long ways on this. You can go down a long, flat cat track, and it's gonna flat base really well. So a very stable, very forgiving ride that's very easy to skid a turn despite how stiff this flex is. And speaking of flex, look at this thing. This thing is a beast. Oh, I cannot. My hand slips off before it really starts to go. The nose is stiff, the waist is stiffer, and the tail is super stiff too. Just in comparison, even though it's not really a good comparison, look at this Alpha Plus. This is a pretty stiff board. Not super stiff, but in comparison to the Ultralight there, it feels like a park board. And there is a lot of dynamic pop going on here, a lot of spring out of a turn and on an ollie if you give it enough effort. But even if you don't, it still rewards you pretty well. Even an average rider like myself can access this pop, but a better rider than myself can really get more out of this board and this stiff flex. What surprised me though is it's okay to butter for how stiff it is, and that just must be because there's some early rise in the nose and the tail, so you get a little extra leverage. It's a little easier to get it buttering, and I could wheelie up on the tail really well in powder and just kind of play around there, and it did a pretty good job. And this flex personality in all kinds of conditions just felt stiff and pretty damp. I expected it to be much more light and poppy, but instead it did really well. It still can be a little cranky in hard micro bumpy snow because of that stiff flex, but I didn't really feel like it was sending that chatter up into my joints like boards like this can often do. And I didn't feel it bucking out of its line and bouncing around. And I rode this midsummer in messy, uneven snow. I rode this in really hard snow, and it never gave that ultralight chatter like a lot of boards do. So I think that's really cool. I still like the Megalight a little better, but this Ultralight is special and damp and fast and mean. When it comes to speed, this base glide is exceptional. It is super glidey and super fast, especially when well waxed. It's just like one of those boards that just, you need to go first on a long traverse because you'll just keep coming up onto your friend's ass and bothering them. So you just say, I'm going first, even if you don't know where you're going, just go first, because you're gonna be going faster than most people's boards on a traverse. When it comes to pointing it, this in good conditions can just bomb. And even in mediocre conditions, it can bomb. It is a very fast board. It's not an ultra bomber, but it's damn close. And if you like big mountain speed, and if you have a steep chute that you need to go down and you might have to straight line a lot of it for safety reasons because there's stuff to the left and right of you, this is a great solution. Now, when it comes to edge hold, I felt it was very competent. Not quite like the old days when they had that like chainsaw grip side cut. They had little like metal bumps. It was like square, and it felt like it slowed down the board a touch, but man, it grabbed like a chainsaw blade. I mean, it was amazing, but it would wear away after a while. After tuning the edges a few times, you're gonna start to lose that grip. But this is very good grip without ever being grabby, and it never felt like it wanted to hold too much in soft snow. Now, when it comes to turn initiation, this is fast to medium fast. It's very quick, especially for my size 9 boots. If you ride in tight spots or tight tree lines, this will turn really well and quickly edge to edge. Once you got it on edge, it wasn't a super turny side cut. I think it leans maybe a touch on the straight line side, but not so much that you can't across the groomer carve or circle carve. I think overall it's very balanced, and it has good spring out of the turn, but not amazing. There are a lot of other free ride boards that I've tried that had a more satisfying carve for my style of riding, but it still has good spring out of the turn and good pop. But like, I felt like the Alpha Plus and the Alpha and the Beta, even the very low-priced Beta, had a much more powerful spring out of the turn and much more lively spring out of the turn. But this is no slouch either, and it's a very fun turning experience. Now, when it comes to powder, there is a good bit of setback on board. And you've got these setback inserts, and I love seeing those on a board like this. One of my complaints with the old Megalight that I owned was that you didn't have a lot of setback on board. Even though it was tapered and directional and pretty floaty, you felt really centered on board, which is great for steep technical terrain, but isn't that ideal in lower angle powder. It's so great to see this setback insert here, and I love it. The only thing I wish is that they kept the stance width more consistent for the setback. To use both these setback inserts, you have to really free your taint and go with a 23-inch wide stance width. I wish it was more in line with a reference stance of 22 inches because that's what you want. And a lot of other companies that do setback inserts keep the reference stance when they do the setback insert. So going from 22 to 23 is really wide. That's an inch difference. That's massive. So I'd love to see them change that out to where the setback inserts work with the reference stance as well. But still, I set this as far back as you can see all the different stance positions here. I went throughout the board depending on the conditions. But on deep powder, I used my Atlas disc to set it all the way back and then tried to put it right here and set it back as far as I could, or set it up mini disc style and set it back so I could get a stance width that's better for me of 21.5 or close to it, 21.75, closer to that, so I could utilize all this setback. But this has really good directional float. Sometimes I felt like the turning experience was a little off coming off other boards to this in powder, but it might have just been me. Sometimes it was great, sometimes it wasn't, but overall I had a really easy time floating in deep powder, and I think this has really good directional float. And I love the versatility of the setback inserts. So when you are riding lower angle POW and you need more directional float like you do often at Mount Bachelor, this is much better for low angle. And then you can still ride it more centered and steep angle powder and have a more centered, more stable feel in that steep stuff. And overall, I think this was really fun to get on. I'm glad I got on it. I think if I were to still choose a board, Megalight or Ultralight, I'd probably choose the Megalight. But man, I can see why some of you would choose the Ultralight, because this is a stiff, pretty damp for an Ultralight, mean, fun ride that still can skid a turn easy in steep technical terrain, but still has good directional float with those setback inserts and powder. If they get those setback inserts to work in a reference stance width, that would be a dream. But as it stands now, this is a very recommendable big mountain to medium mountain ride. Giving advice on YouTube is very difficult because I need a lot of info from you to actually help. So if you want real advice, fill out the Me Harmony profile in the link below so I can help you properly.